When a market becomes cheap enough to utterly dominate, paradoxically, no one ultimately benefits. For multiple decades, the ascent of the Chinese economy seemed completely unassailable. It was the global assembly line, built on a level of operational ruthlessness that almost qualified as high art. We saw metropolises that functioned around the clock, production lines blazing throughout the darkest hours of the night. Their pricing schedules were mechanical, dropping with predictable regularity year after year, until Western rivals simply ran out of energy and stopped competing. This was the widely hailed triumph of immense scale, monolithic discipline, and strategic planning, a colossal civilization transforming vast human effort directly into raw economic capability. But every significant achievement comes at a hidden price. And China's most profound advantage, its institutional ability to manufacture everything cheaper, faster, and bigger than anyone else, has now mutated into the very gravitational force dragging its economy down. Welcome to the Financial Historian, the place where the forces of capital, authority, and history converge, and where initial appearances are never the complete story. The saga of modern China is fundamentally the story of global capitalism pushed to its ultimate threshold, a mechanism that disproportionately rewards relentless expansion at the expense of all else, even when those expenditures actively undermine the long-term foundations upon which its own future depends. So, what exactly is the outcome when the world's most enormous economic entity optimizes itself past the point of endurance? When hyper-efficiency becomes a method of systemic self-destruction? To successfully frame that answer, we must rewind the clock to the origins of the entire Chinese economic marvel. The year was 1978. Deng Xiaoping stood before the highest ranks of the Communist Party and deliberately shattered one of the deepest ideological conventions of pure socialism. His decree to the nation was simple. Acquiring personal wealth was not a source of shame. It was an act of national duty and patriotism. This single statement unleashed perhaps the most rapid and expansive economic transformation the planet has ever witnessed. Literally overnight, millions of agrarian workers found themselves recast as ambitious entrepreneurs. The rural landscape began transforming into factory complexes, and foreign financial interests, beginning with Japanese corporations, followed by firms from the United States, and later major European players, identified a clear and overwhelming opportunity: profoundly inexpensive labor, an essentially limitless workforce, and a governing body desperate to broker deals. Beijing inaugurated a handful of specialized special economic zones, which served as urban laboratories where the conventional rules of the game were suspended. There was no centrally planned economy, no crushing bureaucratic delays, and no stringent ideological loyalty tests. There was one single defining objective: aggressively attract foreign capital and exponentially increase exports. It succeeded spectacularly beyond initial projections. Shenzhen, which had been a quiet fishing community of only 30,000 residents, violently erupted into a sprawling megalopolis housing millions. Within the following 2 decades, this successful blueprint was replicated across the entire country. Every provincial authority desired its own dramatic expansion. Every major city was striving to become the next Shenzhen. Local municipalities aggressively borrowed funds and constructed massive infrastructure: expressways, electrical power grids, sprawling industrial parks, all meticulously designed to entice a greater number of manufacturing operations. By the early 2000s, China was doing more than merely expanding. It was utterly consuming the global requirement for virtually all core commodities: metallurgical steel, coal, refined copper, and oil. Every major Western corporation that wanted to remain competitive had to relocate production offshore to China. If a product could be mass-produced, it was ultimately going to be stamped "Made in China." But underneath that seemingly endless upward trajectory lay a fundamentally flawed and extremely dangerous systemic incentive. The definition of success was simply being less expensive than every other competitor. Each local government entered a bidding war for factories by slashing property values, offering tax holidays, and suppressing worker wages. The firms themselves competed by aggressively cutting their profit margins, reducing material quality, and minimizing their returns. Everyone in the ecosystem was chasing immediate scale and expansion. Absolutely no one was genuinely pursuing long-term fiscal stability or environmental sustainability. It was a vicious pursuit to the bottom, deceptively packaged and sold as economic progress. For a long period, the inherent structural flaw didn't seem to matter. The production apparatus was too overwhelming to fail. Workers poured in from the interior countryside, numbering millions annually, perfectly willing to work 12-hour shifts for a tiny fraction of average Western pay. The assembly facilities never idled. The cargo ports remained active 24 hours a day. Western consumers received their own version of the miracle: the $5 graphic t-shirt, the $300 smartphone, and the comfortable illusion of infinite material abundance existing without inflationary pressure. And China, in turn, became enormously rich. But somewhere between the construction of the 10th new retail complex and the 100th operational steel fabrication plant, the internal system began to critically overheat. The miracle rapidly devolved into an overwhelming institutional dependency. Local authorities needed sustained expansion to service the gargantuan loans they had taken out to build even more production facilities. So, they continued to build them. By the year 2015, China's operational steel capacity alone surpassed the combined total of the rest of the world. Entire designated industrial zones were generating finished commodities faster than the global purchasing power could feasibly absorb them. Consequently, market prices began to descend, not as a result of groundbreaking technological improvement, but driven by sheer corporate desperation. When operational profits evaporated, factories did not slow their output. They actually accelerated, driven by the misguided hope that overwhelming volume could somehow compensate for the collapse of margins. It didn't. That is precisely when a highly specialized new term began to circulate, one borrowed from sociological studies of peasant life, but now applied to economic reality: involution. Involution is not merely about individual people toiling with greater effort for diminishing returns. Economically, it represents the corporate sector generating ever-increasing output for progressively lower revenue. It is a form of competition that ceases to revolve around true technological breakthrough, and instead focuses purely on grim corporate endurance. Historically, the concept of involution applied to Chinese scholars or agricultural workers driving themselves to physical exhaustion for constantly shrinking rewards. But now, the phenomenon is entirely industrial. It has become systemic. Entire colossal sectors are now trapped in a vicious zero-sum conflict for market dominance, where the singular remaining tool is price erosion. Solar photovoltaic modules, advanced electric vehicles, and high-capacity batteries, all of them intended symbols of China's technological future, have morphed into the battlegrounds for this destructive pricing war. Dozens of competing enterprises, many enjoying significant state backing, have flooded global and domestic marketplaces with nearly identical products, each firm aggressively lowering prices to undercut the last. Profit margins have completely dissolved, yet no entity dares to halt production. In a bureaucratic structure where demonstrated output directly correlates with political legitimacy and influence, ceasing production means a catastrophic loss of institutional credibility. Thus, the devastating cycle relentlessly feeds itself. Corporations deeply cut their prices to cling onto their existing market share. Their rivals immediately respond by matching the reduction. Operational profits collapse entirely. Wage growth stagnates for the workforce. Consumers initially celebrate until the broader realization dawns that cheap, endless abundance is purchased at the far greater expense of overall long-term prosperity. China has transitioned into an era of advanced industrial involution, a catastrophic self-consuming feedback loop where hyper-efficiency actively devours profit and overwhelming production annihilates commercial purpose. It is no longer a constructive race to genuinely innovate. It is a primal race toward the bottom of the pricing structure. And like all economic races to the bottom, nobody emerges as a winner. This explains the commercial absurdity of Chinese solar panels being sold globally at a price below the documented cost of manufacturing. It explains why thousands of newly produced electric vehicles accumulate in vast parking lots, stalled and awaiting buyers who do not materialize. It clarifies why domestic technology behemoths are locked in a struggle for the same shrinking consumer demand, even as their actual market valuations plummet. And it certainly reveals why, despite reporting record export volumes, measured industrial profits in China plummeted by over 20% in the first half of 2024. Because when every single competitor is primarily focused on achieving the lowest price point, the only remaining variable that can continue to fall is price itself. This is not some exaggerated form of capitalism on performance-enhancing drugs. It is capitalism actively cannibalizing its own vital organs. And here is the unsettling historical irony. China has experienced this precise dilemma before. During the early 2000s, when catastrophic overproduction in the coal and steel sectors pushed commodity prices to the breaking point, the central government in Beijing was forced to intervene and brutally reduce capacity, shutting down mines, merging vast plants, and laying off hundreds of thousands of workers overnight. That was painful economic triage. The government willingly absorbed intense short-term hardship to avert a total systemic failure. 2 decades later, the exact same dynamics are unfolding. Only this time, the affected patient is not a single isolated industry. It is the core national growth paradigm itself. Factories do not simply close down because a financial spreadsheet dictates they should. They cease operations only when the political apparatus grants permission. And in the Chinese political architecture, contraction is never rewarded. Sustained motion is rewarded, even if that motion is entirely circular and unproductive. Behind the closed doors of the Central Party, high-ranking officials are intimately aware of the devastating numbers: rapidly falling profits, stagnant household wages, and soaring levels of municipal and corporate debt. But in the public sphere, the official government directive remains universally identical. Continue manufacturing, continue expanding, maintain the collective belief. Because if the enormous national economic machine ever completely stops, the political illusion of perpetual progress stops along with it. By the 2020s, China's machine of efficiency had fundamentally changed its nature. It had become a national economy locked in a fiscal and industrial arms race against itself. From an external perspective, it still broadcasts the clear signal of triumph. The outside world observes record export figures, shimmering new manufacturing complexes, and a logistical pipeline of electric automobiles and solar technology so immense it could power entire continents. But internally, operational profit margins are collapsing at an alarming rate. The original miracle had ceased generating net new wealth. It was now merely recirculating existing capital, faster and thinner with every passing year. This is what Western economists technically term overcapacity. But in the Chinese context, overcapacity is not merely a technical flaw. It is, in certain sectors, established policy. Consider the solar industry. In 2023 alone, official Chinese production exceeded twice the world's total accumulated demand for solar panels. Global prices fell nearly 40% in just 12 months. Companies resorted to selling products below their calculated cost just to clear inventory. Dozens of smaller firms were forced into bankruptcy, yet the largest industrial behemoths continued to aggressively produce because their local governments desperately needed the employment figures, the documented output numbers, and the necessary illusion of ongoing progress. Now, examine the electric vehicle market. Well over 100 distinct Chinese EV brands are currently fighting fiercely for the same stagnant domestic consumer base. Each one is engaging in sustained price cuts purely to survive, forcing every competitor to follow suit. The central government attempts to intervene with significant subsidies, hoping to prevent destabilizing mass layoffs. But these government subsidies only amplify the fundamental self-destructive cycle: more subsidized supply, leading to lower prices, resulting in even thinner margins. You can clearly anticipate the trajectory. In the first half of 2024, Chinese industrial profits officially fell by over 20%. This devastating metric held true despite export figures remaining strong. Factories are physically moving more goods than ever before and earning substantially less revenue from every single item. The national economy is still reporting growth, but the intrinsic quality of that growth is actively eroding from the inside out. However, here's the critical inflection point. Not all of this catastrophic overproduction is the result of a simple market mistake. Some of it is entirely by strategic design. The Chinese government has long since mastered the calculated art of weaponized efficiency. The deliberate use of state subsidies to maintain the viability of key national industries long enough to systematically crush and eliminate their global competition. The governing objective is not short-term quarterly profit accountability. The objective is fundamental strategic monopoly. In rapidly developing sectors like advanced solar technology, next-generation batteries, and consumer electric vehicles, Beijing is entirely unconcerned with sustaining short-term financial losses. The ultimate goal is to seize undeniable control of the entire value chain of the future. Local municipalities are injecting billions in capital in the form of massive state-backed loans, cheap land, and aggressive tax abatements, specifically so that these firms can afford to sell their products below cost, not simply to survive, but explicitly to eliminate every viable international rival. The core logic of this maneuver is chillingly ruthless. Overwhelm the global market, aggressively undercut every single manufacturer, and then simply wait. Western competitors, who are stringently bound by the immediate demands of private shareholders and the relentless pursuit of short-term profit, simply cannot sustain the necessary losses. They capitulate. And once the global supply infrastructure becomes structurally dependent on Chinese production for these vital components, China achieves what all monopolies are designed to do: raise prices, unilaterally dictate the terms of trade, and dominate the entire global value chain. This specific economic playbook is far from novel. It is the identical strategy that China previously deployed to secure dominance in bulk steel production, rare earth metals mining, and the international shipbuilding industry. In every single instance, it priced the rest of the world out of the market until the world had no realistic alternative supplier left. But this time, the sheer scale of the operation is absolutely unprecedented. These are not just legacy industrial commodities. These are the foundational materials of the future: lithium-ion battery cells, advanced photovoltaic arrays, electric motor drivetrains. They represent the actual arteries of the 21st century economy. In pure theoretical terms, the strategy is nothing short of brilliant. In practical reality, it is profoundly fragile, because there is a definite limit to the duration an empire can intentionally absorb financial losses, even strategically calculated ones, before the fundamental mechanisms of the system begin to truly decay. When every major industrial sector operates under the expectation that the government will invariably absorb its losses, efficiency rapidly transforms into a crippling financial addiction. Corporations stop competing fiercely on genuine innovation and instead begin competing solely on the accessibility of state subsidies. Productivity quickly degrades into political maneuvering, And the once clear boundary between what constitutes national strategy and what becomes national liability begins to hopelessly blur. That is the hidden, terrifying danger buried within China's price wars. They are not just fierce economic conflicts, they are fast-ticking fiscal time bombs. Every single yuan expended today to keep economically unviable factories operational is borrowed against tomorrow's stability and liquidity. Eventually, without exception, someone must be forced to pay the accumulated bill, and that is precisely what makes this contemporary iteration of the China trap so profoundly tragic. The identical strategy that once enabled China to overwhelmingly conquer international markets is now actively threatening to consume its entire national economy from the inside. Because market domination built squarely upon operational losses is fundamentally not victory. It is merely deferred collapse. It is crucial to understand that it is rarely the total collapse of external demand that finally kills an empire. It is the internal collapse of purpose. And here, that true commercial purpose has been completely supplanted by a rigid political momentum. A highly leveraged system that simply cannot afford to decelerate, because every interconnected tier of the apparatus relies absolutely on continuous motion. Local municipal governments require the factories to keep running simply to service their existing mountain of debt. State-owned financial institutions require those same factories to keep borrowing money to artificially justify their shaky balance sheets. And the central government absolutely requires all of them to maintain the outward illusion of sustained, full employment. If any single component of this complex financial chain comes to an actual stop, the entire structure begins its catastrophic unraveling. So, everyone must continue the pretense that greater industrial output automatically equates to greater national prosperity, even when the data clearly demonstrates it no longer does. This is the underlying political calculus that dictates state capitalism. Production is the undeniable proof of administrative control. When GDP growth stumbles, the state does not strategically retreat. It simply commissions the construction of another factory. When market prices fall, the state pushes them down further. When the private business sector displays any sign of hesitation, local governments step in with even more credit and financing. The state-mandated solution to every emerging economic imbalance is merely to apply more of the same imbalance. It is not irrational economic behavior. It is raw, political survival. Because China's colossal economy is not just an engine designed to generate wealth. It is fundamentally an engine designed to generate political legitimacy. Its social contract contains one paramount clause: maintain the trajectory of growth, and the population will continue to place its faith in the system. That contract functioned perfectly when growth directly translated into significantly rising household incomes. It is failing disastrously now that growth only manages to create marginally cheaper goods. The paradox is devastatingly brutal. China's relentless industrial overproduction successfully maintains low global inflation rates worldwide, yet this very mechanism simultaneously depresses its own internal wages and overall domestic demand. The nation that successfully lifted hundreds of millions of people out of abject poverty is now struggling intensely to raise the actual living standards for those it already saved. And the more aggressively China exports its internal deflationary pressure, the more fundamentally fragile the entire global trading system becomes. In Western nations, the influx of inexpensive Chinese goods was once genuinely perceived as an economic advantage. It effectively kept inflation mild, stocked retail shelves to capacity, and made middle-class life seemingly affordable. But now, that very same material abundance is actively exporting profound weakness. Western manufacturing plants are simply unable to compete with state-subsidized price points. Emerging markets around the globe cannot establish and build their own nascent industries. And the global price being paid for cheap is pervasive economic stagnation. China did not invent this deeply destructive trap. History invented it. The pattern of this specific economic failure is as old as the concept of empire itself. The United Kingdom's coal industry once flooded world markets, driving prices so disastrously low that even British miners could not earn a basic living wage. The imposed solution? Colonies. Captive consumer markets specifically designed to absorb the enormous, unneeded excess production. Japan's highly touted post-war economic miracle in the 1980s smashed directly into the identical brick wall. Mass overcapacity, suffocating deflation, and a rapidly aging demographic that ceased spending. And Rome? Its terminal decline began not with the dramatic invasion of barbarian hordes, but with internal overproduction. Massive state-owned agricultural estates, worked by slave labor, pumped out such staggering volumes of grain that market prices collapsed, systematically bankrupting the small, independent farmers, who were, ironically, the political and military backbone of the Republic. Rome essentially fed itself into a state of acute, internal imbalance. Every single empire that successfully masters the art of radical efficiency eventually faces the same fundamental, existential test. Can it stop the relentless process of optimization long enough to actually achieve structural survival? China's current leadership certainly understands this historical mandate. That is why they constantly reiterate the national priority of rebalancing, shifting the economic engine away from debt-fueled investment-led growth and toward sustained consumer consumption. But genuine rebalancing requires a deliberate, politically difficult slowdown, and time is the singular resource a complex system addicted to perpetual, high-speed growth simply does not possess. So, while the central authority in Beijing attempts to gently steer the national ship toward the distant horizon of true innovation and domestic consumption, the provincial governments are still aggressively financing the construction of more factories, more infrastructure, and generating ever greater output. Because that is what the local political incentives relentlessly demand. It is the economic equivalent of trying to maintain a strict diet while the national kitchen staff insists on aggressively cooking 5 extra meals every hour. The ultimate irony is that many of China's most overproduced commodities, solar panels, power batteries, and electric vehicles, are precisely the technologies the rest of the world urgently requires for the critical energy transition. But when prices are collapsing and corporations are consistently failing, even green revolutions can stall and fail. The rest of the world benefits from technologically cheaper products, but this comes at the direct, unrecoverable cost of China's own economic profitability. Cheap abundance becomes a financial and political trap, not because it fails to generate things, but because it actively destroys the necessary motivation and incentive to create more profit. And once that crucial incentive vanishes, efficiency immediately turns from a virtue into a deeply destructive disease. China's core problem is not insufficient productivity. It is, terrifyingly, too much productivity. It is an economic empire that has become the absolute master of physical production, but has tragically lost its fundamental structural balance. A massive system capable of flooding every global market with goods, yet one that cannot generate sufficient internal or external demand to make that process reliably profitable. There is a cruel symmetry in this outcome. The very powerful force that propelled China toward unprecedented wealth, a culture of relentless, cutthroat competition, now structurally ensures that no one within the system can rest long enough to remain wealthy. This is the inevitable consequence when exponential growth becomes the national identity, when ceaseless physical production replaces genuine commercial purpose, And when the singular measure of true progress is defined by how much cheaper you can generate something that the world no longer urgently needs more of, that is not sustainable development. It is industrial scale involution. And like every empire that preceded it, China is rapidly learning the harrowing truth that there is absolutely nothing more financially expensive than being persistently too cheap. Because when a system optimizes every single variable except for its own delicate balance, eventually, the only remaining thing left to actively destroy is itself. If this analysis provided you with a new, deeper perspective on the global economy, please hit subscribe. History has all the answers, and I will always show you precisely where to look.